All right, and let us finish this chapter of A Tale of Two Cities. It's chapter 14 of the second book, which is called The Honest Tradesman. The name of the book is The Golden Thread. We are at the Cruncher household where I, your humble reader, hurt his throat and got nauseous doing Cruncher's voice as he berated his wife about praying for him. But we'll pick up at the end of that paragraph. This touched young Jerry on a terrible place, who adjured his mother to perform her first duty and whatever else she did or neglected above all things that lay a special stress on the discharge of that maternal function so affectionately and delicately indicated by his other parent. Thus the evening wore away with the Cruncher family until young Jerry was ordered to bed, and his mother, laid under similar injunctions, obeyed them. Mr. Cruncher beguiled the earlier watches of the night with solitary pipes, and did not start upon his excursion until nearly 1 o'clock. Toward that small and ghostly hour he rose up from his chair, took a key out of his pocket, opened a locked cupboard, and brought forth a sack, a crowbar of convenient size, a rope and chain, and other fishing tackle of that nature. Disposing these articles about him in a skilful manner, he bestowed a parting defiance on Mrs. Cruncher, and extinguished the light, and went out. Young Jerry, who had only made a feint of undressing when he went to bed, was not long after his father. Under cover of the darkness, he followed out of the room, followed down the stairs, followed down the court, followed out into the streets. He was in no uneasiness concerning his getting into the house again, for it was full of lodgers. The door stood ajar all night. Impelled by a laudable ambition to study the art and mystery of his father's honest calling, young Jerry, keeping close to house fronts, walls, and doorways, as his eyes were close to one another, held his honored parent in view. The honored parent, steering northward, had not gone far when he was joined by another disciple of Isaac Walton, and the two trudged on together. Within half an hour from the first starting, they were beyond the winking lamps, and more than winking watchmen, and were out upon the lonely road. Another fisherman was picked up here, and so silently that if young Jerry had been superstitious, he might have supposed the second fellow, of a gentle craft to have, all of a sudden, split himself into two. The three went on, and young Jerry went on, until the three stopped under a bank overhanging the road. Upon the top of the bank was a low brick wall, surmounted by an iron railing. In the shadow of the bank and wall the three turned out of the road, and up a blind lane, of which the wall, there risen to some 8 or 10 feet high, formed one side. Crouching down in a corner, peeping up the lane, the next object that young Jerry saw was the form of his honored parent, pretty well defined against a watery and clouded moon, nimbly scaling an iron gate. He was soon over, and then the second fisherman got over, and then the third. They all dropped softly on the ground within the gate, and lay there a little, listening perhaps. Then they moved away on their hands and knees. It was now young Jerry's turn to approach the gate, which he did, holding his breath. Crouching down again in a corner there, and looking in, he made out the three fishermen creeping through some rank grass, and all the gravestones in the churchyard. It was a large churchyard that they were in, looking on like ghosts in white, while the church tower itself looked like a ghost of a monstrous giant. They did not creep far before they stopped and stood upright, and then they began to fish. They fished with a spade at first. Presently the honored parent appeared to be adjusting some instrument like a great corkscrew. Whatever tools they worked with, they worked hard until the awful striking of the church clock so terrified young Jerry that he made off with his hair as stiff as his father's. But his long-cherished desire to know more about these matters not only stopped him in his running away, but lured him back again. They were still fishing, perseveringly, when he peeped into the gate for the second time, but now they seemed to have got a bite. There was a screwing and complaining sound down below, and their bent figures were strained as if by a weight. By slow degrees the weight broke away the earth upon it, and came to the surface. Young Jerry knew very well. Knew very, young Jerry very well knew what it would be, but when he saw it, and saw his honored parent about to wrench it open, he was so frightened, being new to the sight, that he made off again and never stopped until he had run a mile or more. He would not have stopped then for anything less necessary than breath, it being a spectral sort of race that he ran, and one highly desirable to get to the end of. He had a strong idea that the coffin he had seen was running after him, and pictured as hopping on behind him, bolt upright upon its narrow end, always on the point of overtaking him and hopping on at his side, perhaps taking his arm. It was a pursuer to shun. It was an inconsistent and ubiquitous fiend, too, for well it was making the whole night behind him dreadful. He darted out into the roadway, to avoid dark alleys, fearful of its coming hopping out of them like a dropsical boy's kite without tail or wings. It hid in doorways, too, rubbing its horrible shoulders against doors, and drawing them up to its ears, as if it were laughing. It got into shadows on the road, and lay cunningly on its back to trip him up. All this time it was increasingly hopping on behind and gaining on him, so that when the boy got to his own door he had reason for being half dead, and even then it would not leave him, but followed him upstairs, with a bump on every stair, scrambled into bed with him, and bumped down, dead and heavy, on his breast when he fell asleep. From his oppressed slumber, young Jerry, in his closet, was awakened after daybreak and before sunrise by the presence of his father in the room. Something had gone wrong with him, at least so young Jerry inferred, from the circumstances of his holding Mrs. Cruncher by the ears and knocking the back of her head against the headboard of the bed. "I told you I would," said Mr. Cruncher, "and I did." "Jerry, Jerry, Jerry," his wife implored. "You oppose yourself to the profit of the business," said Jerry, "and me and my partners suffer. You was to honour and obey. Why the devil don't you?" "I try to be a good wife, Jerry," the poor woman protested with tears. "Is it being a good wife to oppose your husband's business? Is it honouring your husband to dishonour his business? Is it obeying your husband to disobey him on the will subject of his business?" "You hadn't taken not to the dreadful business then, Jerry." "I've enough for you," retorted Mr. Cruncher, "to be the wife of an honest tradesman, and not to occupy your female mind with calculations when he took to his trade, or when he didn't. A honouring and obeying wife would let his trade alone altogether. Call yourself a religious woman. If you're a religious woman, give me a irreligious one. You have no more natural sense of duty than the bed of this here Thames River has a pile, and similarly it must be knocked into you." The altercation was conducted in a low tone of voice, and terminated in the honest tradesman's kicking off his clay-soiled boots and lying down on his length of the floor. After taking a timid peep at him lying on his back, with his rusty hands under his head for a pillow, his son lay down too and fell asleep again. There was no fish for breakfast, and not much of anything else. Mr. Cruncher was out of spirits, and out of temper, and kept an iron pot lid by him as a projectile for the correction of Mrs. Cruncher, in case he should observe any symptoms of her saying grace. He was brushed and washed at the usual hour, and set off with his son to pursue his ostensible calling. Young Jerry, walking with the stool under his arm at his father's side along sunny and crowded Fleet Street, was a very different young Jerry from him of the previous night, running home through darkness and solitude from his grim pursuer. His cunning was fresh with the day, and his qualms were gone with the night, in which particulars it was not improbable that he had compeers in Fleet Street and the city of London that fine morning. "Father," said young Jerry, as they walked along, taking care to keep an arm's length, and to have the stool well between them, "what's a resurrection, man?" Mr. Cruncher came to a stop on the pavement before he answered. "How should I know?" "I thought you knowed everything, father," said the artless boy. Well," returned Mr. Cruncher, going on again and lifting off his hat to give his spikes free play, "he's a tradesman." "What's his goods, father?" asked the brisk young Jerry. "His goods," said Mr. Cruncher, after turning it over in his mind, "is a branch of scientific goods." "Persons' bodies, ain't it, father?" asked the lively boy. "I believe it is something of that sort," said Mr. Cruncher. "Oh, father, I should like to be a resurrection man when I'm quite growed up." Mr. Cruncher was soothed, but shook his head in a dubious and moral way. "It depends upon how you develop your talents. Be careful you develop your talents, and never say no more than you can help to nobody, and there's no telling at the present time what you may not come to be fit for." As young Jerry, thus encouraged, went on a few yards in advance to plant the stool in the shadow of the bar, Mr. Cruncher added to himself, "Jerry, you honest tradesman, there's hopes what that boy will yet be a blessing to you and a recompense to you for his mother." And that's the end of chapter 14.